Stories Press, right? And this is the new revised edition, because media always has to be revised, and it could use a little visedness too. So I was impressed by the drama, I must admit, of your engagement with Herr Dr. Professor Sec of State Henry Kissinger at Harvard when you were a Nieman Fellow in 1976. Could you tell us what a Nieman Fellow is and how you got there?
Yeah. I'm a television producer now, but in 1977 I was given a fellowship to Harvard by what's called the Nieman Foundation, supposedly to advance the quality and standards of journalism. Lucius Nieman was the publisher of a paper out, I think, in Milwaukee, and he had a lot of money. He endowed this program at Harvard. Walter Lippmann is the sort of guiding guru of it.
So it's an old foundation.
Yeah, it's a man named Louis Lyons, who was a well-known broadcaster for many years, ran the foundation. And generally speaking, they give grants to journalists in their mid-careers to come to Harvard, study whatever they want, be exposed to a lot of different luminaries and ideas, and basically take a year off of work. And then hopefully, as a result of this recognition and the credibility that Harvard's association blesses you with, you can then go onward and upwards in your career. And as part of this Nieman Fellowship, when I arrived, it was the 40th anniversary of the program, and they had a big celebration for the Nieman Fellowship. Former alumnus and alumni came back from all over the world. The featured speaker was none other than Henry Kissinger. He was invited to...
He had taught at Harvard.
He had taught at Harvard for many years.
Graduate.
And this was his first appearance in public after he left government, after the Carter administration replaced the Ford administration.
He has left government, hasn't he?
Well,
But
nominally.
Not media. I understand he's employed by one of the networks.
Well, he's gone from, Henry Kissinger has been an advisor, paid advisor, to all of the networks at one point or another. And he has a company now called Kissinger and Associates, represents foreign governments, big corporations, the Chinese army, and who knows what other clients.
The Chinese army?
Yeah, I think he did, yeah.
He's going to have a conflict of interest now, I think.
Well, at any rate, he, as a result of his visit to China, he's managed to develop a lot of contacts. Henry Kissinger is a great believer in know-who as well as know-how. And he's been able to parlay those into a very lucrative consulting business. At any rate, up at Harvard, he was speaking to the journalists, and of course he was doing so off the record. Now, this created a bit of a conflict for many of the young student journalists who felt, first of all, Harvard should not allow somebody like Kissinger to come and speak off the record. Secondly, they wanted to cover it and were told that they couldn't. The Harvard Crimson. So they picketed.
Any other journalists there? Just the Crimson, was it?
Well, I guess other journalists were told they couldn't quote him as well. At any rate, the Crimson showed up and they picketed the place. I was there, my first appearance as a Nieman Fellow, wearing my new suit, and I came into the Boston Museum of Science, which is all the exhibits, where the hip bones connect to the other bones, and the various other accoutrements of a science museum. And there was the big affair with Henry the K. As I was crossing to go in, I was confronted by the pickets who said, "How can you cross a picket line? How can you go see this pig, this war criminal?" And I explained, well, this is part of my responsibility as a Nieman Fellow to take part in the events, and that I was going to go in. They said, I asked them what the problem was. They said, we want to...
You were a little embarrassed by going.
Well,
That's what you said in the book.
I was a little embarrassed. I was sort of mildly opportunistic at the time.
I would have been conflicted.
At any rate, as I went into the Museum of Science, I asked the editor of the Crimson what question she wanted to ask Kissinger. I said, write it down. If I get a chance, I'll ask him your question. That way, I could feel less guilty, and their views could be represented. So, she wrote her question down on a little card. I slipped it into my suit jacket. Well, there follows the Kissinger speech, and Henry is in very good form. He's on first-name basis with many of the journalists who were there. Hello, Mort, good to see you. I haven't seen you since the shuttle, to Damascus. It was this sort of a really a feeling of an old boys club. And so many questions were raised. Anthony Lewis of the New York Times asked a question about Africa. Kissinger kind of kissed it off quickly. One guy got up with a sign and said, Cambodia was off the record too. And he was sort of hissed, and he sat down. So finally my hand went up. I couldn't take this anymore. I was really upset by this display of congeniality between Kissinger and the people who covered him, And so I raised my hand, and I was called on last. And I hadn't looked at what the question was, but I stood up and in a dramatic form, explained that there had been pickets outside and that they had wanted to ask questions and they weren't being allowed to. And the editor of the Harvard Crimson asked me to ask this question in dramatic form. I pulled it out of my pocket. Kissinger was sitting there with his son David, who's now a big Hollywood executive, sitting next to him. Then David was maybe 12 or 13. And the question was, Dr. Kissinger, how can you justify yourself to your own children after 6 million people were killed in Indochina? Now, Kissinger's son looked up at him. The room quieted down dramatically. I realized that I had just stepped in a pile of shit, that, my career was over. How could I have been so stupid to embarrass, Henry Kissinger and myself, in a sense, in this setting, because it was like the media elite was there. It was like the creme de la creme of everyone. Half the audience booed me. There was a trickle of applause. At any rate, Kissinger stood up dramatically, looked right out, and he said, "Mr. Schechter, I will not be lectured by you or anyone else. It is very easy to criticize, but," and he went on in that vein about it. He didn't have to take any questions like this from people like me. He then immediately, after he finished, turned around and walked out of the room. And there was supposed to be a big after-dinner handshake event with him and all the rest of it. So the whole place came to almost a state of pandemonium as a result of all of this. I was convinced that I would never get a job in this town again, that there was no way after doing that. But what happened was, some journalist was there from the Crimson who had snuck in with his father. He wrote about it. Then the Boston Globe, now that the embargo was broken, the Boston Globe wrote about it. Soon the New York Times Sunday Magazine wrote about it. And suddenly my view of myself changed dramatically too. Suddenly I was the man that gave Henry heartburn. I felt very good. I had been successful. And then suddenly I was a media hero. And I did get a job years later. But this is one of the events that I describe in my book, The More You Watch, the Less You Know. I try to make it anecdotal and funny, and to try to tell some stories about what it's like to be in the media world, what it's like to work at places like CNN and ABC News, and now at Global Vision, my company.
Okay, I'm reminded now of what Madame Albright, as she's called, also called someone named Madame Half-Bright. When she was asked about the fatalities, I forget now, I think in Yugoslavia now, she said, it's a price we're prepared to pay.
Well, it was actually, she was asked about Iraq and civilian casualties in Iraq, and that's what she said. She was pushed by 60 Minutes. She thought the cost was too high. She said she didn't think it was.
Well, she has a very large pocketbook, I think. Dead body.
Well, my theory is that the Albanian delegation that signed that agreement in France, you'll remember they rejected the agreement. And a lot of pressure came down from the United States because I think they feared correctly that there would be a tremendous confrontation and they would lose and that Kosovo could be destroyed. But nevertheless, the U.S. pressured them to sign the agreement. And I just picture the scene in that room with this Albanian delegation, 10 hours in a room with Madeleine Albright. Imagine that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure these guys said to themselves, I'll sign anything to get out of this room. Where do I sign? And I'm sure that that's the story behind the story, although I don't know that for a fact.
I was going to say the League of Nations. If they appeal to the UN, maybe they can have that agreement overturned.
Well, unfortunately, we're in the middle of a war right now, and truth is the first casualty of war. Well, the United States, NATO, 19 countries bombing Serbia. And, the consequences of it are not only, there's always two wars, and this is one of the things I write about. There's the war we see on TV, but there's the media war, which is the war of TV. And weapons not only communicate, but weapons are a form of communication. And in this particular case, truth is the casualty on all sides. We have propaganda coming out of Serbia, where the opposition forces were muzzled, and here in America, the opposition forces are marginalized and can really get on the air to criticize what's going on. So we have almost a symmetry between the United States and Serbia, but by different means, both seem to be committed to squelching independent voices.
Okay, so you survived the Kissinger blight, and now you have your own company with other associates. When we're going to take a tour of the company, but first a little background. When did you start the company?
Well, I worked at 2020 at ABC News for 8 years. I was a producer there.
What years was it?
In the 80s, and in about 1988, I left ABC and I formed Global Vision. We were immediately called Heroes of Downward Mobility for making that choice, and we produced several programs that we considered to be important. One of them was South Africa Now, a series about the struggle in South Africa for change. The other, Rights and Wrongs, a human rights series, which was on public television for 4 years, and a lot of other films, documentaries, and other programming.
Do you want to do the tour now, or would you rather talk about it?
Well, let's talk some more. I think,
yeah, okay.
I think I can imagine that the viewers are just fixated on this.
Yeah. All right. Let's.
It's so compelling.
All right. So, how and where and when did you get started in journalism?
I actually got started in journalism at the mighty DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, in the Bronx, New York. It used to be here in Manhattan. At one point,
the School of Criminal Justice.
Well, at one point, DeWitt Clinton had 12 or 14,000 students, and it was in many buildings throughout Manhattan. It is now in the Bronx. It's been there since the 40s.
You went to school in the Bronx.
And I went to high school there. And
what area of the Bronx was it?
It's the North Bronx. It's Marshallville Parkway.
And was it like a middle-class area?
Well, I lived in a place called the Amalgamated, which is a housing co-op. It was built by the unions. And my father was a garment worker at that time before he retired, and we lived in this co-op oasis in this particular community, working class housing.
What year was that?
This was, I went to high school in '56 when I started, and graduated in 1960, went on to Cornell University.
So did you work on the high school paper?
Yes, I did, the Clinton News.
And what do you remember from that experience?
I remember being excited about journalism. I remembered learning the techniques of journalism. I remembered, that the media could be a powerful tool. My heroes at that point were, Edward R. Murrow and people like that.
Were you very political then at the time?
Well, I was political. I was emerging. My consciousness, my political understanding was emerging. My parents were kind of liberals in the classic sense.
They voted for FDR.
I would think so.
Yeah. So were there any problems on the high school paper? You could do whatever you want?
When I look at the high school paper now, by 60s standards and subsequent standards, it was pretty tame.
Yeah.
It was pretty institutional, but it was pretty good. It was, I think, very good training in journalism, and there were many people who passed through the publications at DeWitt Clinton High School, like James Baldwin, and many journalists who worked on the paper, and I think it was a good training ground to get into journalism and to learn about journalism. Pardon me?
Dr. Rowe go to Clinton?
I don't know if he did or not.
Anyway, so then you went to Cornell.
Went to Cornell.
What were you?
I was studying labor history at Cornell, and I edited a magazine called Dialogue. Years later, I would say, I went from Dialogue to Diatribe.
I know a literary magazine, I think, called Dialogue.
No, this was a sort of political current affairs magazine, which started in 1960 around with the civil rights movement. And, it was part of an effort to try to encourage activism and involvement on campus. I was, became involved.
Was that sponsored by the college? Or
no, it was something that another freshman, Ken Rubin and myself created. And it went for about 6 or 7 years, a few years after we graduated. But it was a quarterly magazine.
And then?
And then I dropped out of college. I became part of the civil rights movement.
What year was that?
64. As a civil rights worker, became a community organizer.
Where?
In Syracuse, New York. I worked in Mississippi. I worked in Baltimore. And I worked in Harlem.
If I would ask you, what turned you into that? What would you say?
I think the times, I think the period. I think, in high school we covered the sit-in movement in 1960, and I was really impressed by the heroism and the courage and the bravery of these students who were involved. In fact, one of the
blacks in your high school?
Oh yeah, our school was very racially integrated, and one of the students actually who sat in Greensboro, North Carolina, came out of Harlem and had gone to Clinton. So I identified with that whole activist movement. We picketed Woolworths in the Bronx in the early 60s, and I became a social activist. I became more and more involved in the movement.
Did that go off smoothly? You weren't busted? How did the city authorities take your picketing?
Well, we do have a First Amendment. People are allowed to picket.
Okay, yeah.
We picketed. But gradually, like many other people with the war in Vietnam, I became more politicized, more radical, more active, if you will. I became friendly years later with Abbie Hoffman and became part of the Yippies, actually. There were few people at the formation of Yippie: Ed Sanders, Jerry Rubin, Abbie Hoffman, Paul Krasner, and me. So I was, however, living in London at the time. I had gone to London School of Economics, so I wasn't in New York during that whole period.
So what were you doing? What was your motive in going to the School of Economics?
Well, I was interested in learning more about the world, and I moved to...
It was sort of part of your interest in labor history.
And I moved to London, and I worked for Ramparts magazine. I was an London editor of Ramparts. I became a writer. I did my first film in London called Student Power, about the student movement in England. Mm-hmm. And, I think my political awareness and my global awareness started there.
Was he a student then?
He wasn't a student then, but I got to know people who were part of his world. The New Left Review, it was called. It was the New Left in England, the New Left in America.
Still going.
Yeah. So I think that's the ideas that sort of got me going.
How long were you at the London School?
I was there for 2 years.
And did you, why am I asking this question? Did you get a degree?
I don't know. Well, we're going into...
Because I wonder if
I did get a degree.
Yeah, were you on an academic track?
Yes, I was. I did a 1-year course in 2 years. And
you kept busy.
And was involved also with a lot of the student activism in London. In fact, there's a BBC crew that's coming over to talk to me about a big demonstration in England that I was part of. If you remember, Bill Clinton was in England
at the same
time, and was also supportive of the anti-war movement. I think I met him then.
You got a master's?
A master's degree.
What was your thesis?
Political sociology. It was culture and politics, about yippies as a form of political activism.
Have you read it lately?
I actually did, yeah.
It's pretty good, right?
A little academic, but it wasn't bad, But then I came back to the States in '68, moved to Boston.
Why did you do that?
Because everything was happening here. It was the time to be here.
I see. It wasn't that you were driven out of England.
No. I didn't want to be an academic. I was attracted to being a journalist. I was attracted to coming back to take part in what was happening here in the States.
It was more exciting.
And
it was more important.
And I worked in the
you were an American,
underground press, and also then got into radio and went to work for WBCN in Boston.
What papers did you work for then?
A paper called The Old Mole.
Yeah, I know that paper.
But I also wrote for the Boston Phoenix and the Real Paper, and
were you in the Boston area?
And Liberation News Service. Pardon?
You were in the Boston area?
I lived in Boston.
Where did you live? In Boston?
In Somerville and in Cambridge.
The cheaper rent, right, than Cambridge. Borders Cambridge.
Affordable rent, Tuli. Affordable rent.
So while you were doing the print journalism, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, this is my resume.
No, it's an interesting story,
Go ahead.
How you got from there to here, and so you were in print journalism, and then you got into radio. How did that happen?
Well, a friend of mine had gotten a job at this rock and roll station at WBCN in 1970, And one day,
Give us 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Okay.
a few days on the job, his own name came up on the wire, on the AP wire, which was, clacking away in the station at that time. We didn't have computers back then. And it turned out that he had been indicted by the FBI. So that indictment...
What was his name? Do you want to give his name?
Yeah, his name is Bo Burlingham. Was now a writer for a magazine called Inc. on small businesses up in Boston. And Bo had been involved in the Weather Underground, and he was indicted. The charges were later dropped. They were preposterous. It was a setup. But because of that, it created a vacancy at the radio station. That's how I got my job. So thank you, J. Edgar Hoover, long overdue, for creating that vacancy. And then I moved on, and I stayed at WBCN as Danny Schechter, the news dissector, for 10 years.
You enjoyed that?
Yeah, I did. It was a daily, doing the daily news on the most popular radio station in Boston.
Is there, I know it was a sort of a lively program. Is there anything like that now going on anywhere? In Boston or any other city?
Well, I mean, what has happened, this was on a commercial station, which was both open to alternative music at the time and alternative information. But, what has happened is sort of a media cleansing, thanks to the FCC, thanks to the changing laws, thanks to corporate pressures, dissident voices, dissident voices, countercultural institutions, and don't forget, these were stations that made a lot of money. These were not stations that were dependent on donations.
The underground press was being supported by the record company, a lot of it. And it always seemed a little job.
Well, we live in a world with a lot of contradictions. If you live in a capitalist culture, many of the institutions, even that are challenging it, are affected by it and are influenced by it.
Yeah, Marx knew that too. He claimed that he invested in the stock market and made money, but he may have invested in it, but it's also claimed that he never made any money. And his mother also said, this is like one of those things you think is too good to be true, it has to be manufactured. But I saw it in print. No, I saw it in his collected letters, and his mother actually wrote to him. He wrote to Engels, I think, that his mother had said to him, Carl, instead of writing about capital, why don't you make some capital? It's sort of like...
Well, his birthday was actually 3 days ago, so I hope you were commemorating it.
Well, I don't...
My birthday broadcast.
Yeah, this might be the Karl Marx Memorial broadcast. So how many minutes do we have?
7.
Oh, we have 7. All right. So
now we're in 1970. Okay, we're now in 1999. Should we move quickly over this other ground?
Yeah. Why did you leave the? Move quickly and bring us up to date.
Well, I worked in radio for 10 years.
Yeah.
I got the Sneeman Fellowship at Harvard. I made a transition into TV. I became an on-air reporter.
That's what got you the Neiman, I think, right? Your broadcasting.
Yeah, my radio broadcasting. I then, became an on-air reporter at WGBH Channel 2 in Boston, PBS. I moved into commercial broadcasting. I became part of CNN when it first started. I moved to Atlanta and did their 10 to 11 talk show program. I then moved to New York after not wanting to really be in Atlanta. I moved up to New York and went to work for ABC News 2020. I was there for 8 years.
What was that like? I must admit, all I can remember is 60 Minutes. I don't do that much TV watching. So most of our viewers know 60 Minutes, right? 49, 59, 60. So how did that relate to that? Was it a derivative show or?
2020 was ABC's version of 60 Minutes. But to try to move news magazines into prime time, they were an early pioneer in doing that. You see, in television...
Who were the names connected with it?
Well, Barbara Walters and then later Hugh Downs. They started with a first show which was a total disaster. It was taken off the air, reconstituted. Hugh Downs hosted the show for many years. I've heard he's just stepped down. And Barbara Walters came on board. And,
Is it still going?
It's still going. Not only is it still going...
Is Barbara Walters still there?
She's still there. Not only is she still there, Tuli, but they're on 2020 is on 3 nights a week.
Really?
News magazines have become to dominate all primetime television.
How would you estimate, now that you're gone and can't be fired, how would you estimate that show, the value of it and its development? Or you want to talk about that?
That's, the inside story, Tuli. That's like the inside of the inside. And that's what I've written about in this book. The more you watch, the less you know.
So you're not going to tell us?
I'm going to tell you. I'm going to talk about it.
You have to buy the book?
It would help me if you did buy the book. But look, I work there. I have 3 chapters in the book about working in a news magazine. And basically what happens is that infotainment values take over from journalistic values. There's been a merger between news biz and showbiz. And show business values because
But
and
politics
packaging.
is always showbiz.
I understand, but I think we've seen an acceleration of this.
It's bad showbiz.
It's very profitable.
But
showbiz.
there's good theater and bad theater.
Always has been, always will be. But in this particular instance, the news magazines have become the dominant program format of the late 90s. Dateline on NBC. 2020 now is the one show that's replaced all the other news magazines on ABC.
It's an hour show?
CBS, 60 Minutes has 60 Minutes 1, 60 Minutes 2, 48 hours. News magazines make a lot of money. And
You got 2 minutes.
they often don't cover a lot of stories in a very in-depth way. And I became dissatisfied with it, and I organized with my partner Rory O'Connor Global Vision,
Because
which
you
is the
can-
next part of the
It
story.
can be in-depth and crap, too.
Absolutely.
So, when we come back next week, we're going to
Pick up the story
pick up the story at Global Vision.
at Global Vision. That's where we are right
And
now.
don't forget to remember that we'll be here in 2 weeks, same time, same channel, Halavai. Bye-bye. Another minute? All right, then I'll tell you, then I'll have to tell you, I'll tell you what I watch, for what it's worth. I watch CNN, which is like very wide and this deep, They'll put a camera anywhere, and every single one of their news people has the intelligence and the historical background of a platypus, I think. And I love their military experts. They're people who used to kill people and now tell you how the other people are killing people. That's also the depth of their understanding. But listen, it's free, right? Except you have to have those fucking ads all the time.
Well, it's not free, and that's the whole problem, is that essentially television, which was advertiser-supported, is now supported in part by you, cable television.
Yeah, that's
which is the only
true.
way you can get CNN.
That's true.
It has been increased in cost over many, many
Yeah,
years.
yeah.
So what they've done is repackage television.
And make you pay for the shit.
There you go.